Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Welcome to the first event in the lecture series of Ali Buralak's Center for Islamic Studies during the fall 2011 seminar. We are happy to see you all here. 2010, thank you. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I would like to note that we already have the full list of events for this semester, and you can pick up that sheet from the table in the corner. When you're doing that, you can also put your emails in our email list. And some of you are interested in our MA program, which is starting in fall 2011. That's when I was referring. And if you are interested in our MA program and want to talk to us, and we are starting a new MA program in Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies, please write your name on that sign-up sheet for the MA program, Master's Program in Islamic Studies, so that this way we can start corresponding and get your applications in time. Some of the events that is coming up next week is that on Tuesday, 1:30, we will have a lecture by John Kaiser on his book on Emir Abdul Qadir of Algeria. And on Thursday, 3 o'clock, we have a lecture by Omid Safi on his book on Legacies of Prophet Muhammad. Both of these events are part of the Fall for the Book series, and we will hope to see you there in the Grand Tier, third floor of Center for the Arts, next building here. So before long ado, I will like to introduce our speaker, who just published an impressive book, Manal Omar, who is actually a George Mason University alum, and she's happy to be back to the campus and see all the changes that happen. She's a very good example of how successful our graduates can be. Manal finished George Mason and then did her MA at Georgetown in Arab Studies, then started a very impressive career in international organizations and international non-governmental organizations, starting with World Bank, and then Oxfam and Woman to Woman International, and then finally her current job at United States Institute of Peace. And some of you want to get job in the future, but we can connect you with our alum and about how to get jobs in these prestigious organizations. Soon to be Dr. Manal Omar, is considered one of the leading Muslim intellectuals, public intellectuals in the country. In fact, Islamica Magazine named her one of the top 10 young visionaries shaping Islam in America. She was in Iraq in this most crucial time between 2003 and 2005, personally helping Iraqi families and women representing an NGO. And based on her experience, she wrote a very impressive book. There are a lot of questions about international NGOs and what work to be done in Iraq. In our classes on international history, we are talking about NGOs as an alternative to the governmental agencies, or an alternative to the government's policies. And Manal can evaluate what kind of alternative it is and what NGOs can do. We'd like to invite Manal to talk about her book. Please, Manal.
Thank you, Jamil, and I'd like to thank the Global Islamic Studies Center for putting this together. It's wonderful to be here. It's great to be back on campus. It's very exciting to see how much Mason has progressed since I've left. I feel a little jealous. We didn't have all these awesome buildings and these, new equipment and everything that you guys have now, so it's great to be a part of it. I wanted to kind of first establish kind of what this would be today. I was hoping for an informal discussion. I'm going to leave as much time as possible for questions and answers, so please keep that in mind as I begin to talk. And I wanted to share with you why I decided to write this book. For the past 12 years, I've been working in international development. I've primarily worked in Iraq, but I've also worked in Afghanistan, Sudan, and worked in Lebanon and Yemen. I was also part of the 2006 response to the Lebanon war and to the Gaza crisis. And I realized that there was a need to get more of a personal side to the conflict out there. The Middle East, conflict in general, is always overshadowed by so much violence that we begin to forget the humans that are actually living through this. And if we do remember them, we only remember them as victims. We don't recognize that they're moving towards becoming survivors and establishing their role as active global citizens. And that's kind of the story I wanted to tell. And I wanted to particularly focus on women. I really feel strongly that when we look at conflict, it's not just a matter of supporting women in conflict zones because it's the right thing to do, or these poor women, we're going to sweep in and save the women. It's really looking at women as a barometer of success. If we want to be successful in our interventions as international NGOs, as governments, or whatever the intervention will look like, women can provide a barometer of success or failure in terms of where we're going in these countries. And I particularly look at the issue of Iraq. When we look at the Iraqi women in 2003, and something that I outline in the book, was you saw a lot of excitement, optimism, and women were talking about leaping forward. They're saying this is their opportunity. Iraqi women had always had very advanced rights. They had always had legal rights, it's dating back into the 50s and the 60s. Some of the civil society organizations were early as the 1920s. So after 2003, there was a feeling that we'd just gone through these dark ages of sanctions and a dictatorship, and now we're going to leap forward. The reality 7 years later is very different. Women are now in the position where they're trying to just maintain the status quo. The laws that were once guaranteed to them are now being threatened. And what we saw was that because we weren't paying attention to a lot of these women's issues, things that I call red flags that had been raised were not addressed. And it's not only impacting women, but it impacts the nation as a whole. One of the conversations I always share in terms of my arguments with some of the military on the ground was when I would point out saying, we need to be focusing on women, we need to work on women's issues inside Iraq. They would say, no, we have priorities, ma'am, and we've got to get security right, and then we'll talk about women. And my response was always, you won't get security right until you talk about women. That again, they are the starting point. They have the pulse on community, and focusing on women really provides us a window into society as a whole. The other thing I explored in my book was the multiple identities that I entered Iraq with. I'm originally Palestinian. I grew up as a Muslim in South Carolina and Northern Virginia, and felt that I had this diverse background that would then allow me to go into a country like Iraq and understand what the Iraqis were going through. The reality is I couldn't have been further from the truth. There was a lot of things within my own identity that Iraqis fought back on, not only my gender, but also my age. And the different identities that I struggled with, I think, were very universal to us as an American community in terms of the immigrant experience and the different experiences that we have growing up. And I thought it was an important story to tell. So that was kind of the reasons why I put the book together and why I wanted to share my memoir. The book has been out for a month, and there have been two other unintended consequences that came out of the book. One was it came in the midst of a lot of the discussions about the role of American Muslims in the public sphere. So I received a lot of emails asking me about that particular aspect of my identity, and a lot of challenges asking me to choose. What would you consider? Are you an American? Are you an Arab? Or are you Muslim? Particularly those who read the book felt that kind of unsatisfied that I wouldn't choose one identity over the other. And the other set of emails that I got, which I hadn't anticipated, was a lot of military families. So a lot of mothers and wives who lost soldiers, who lost their family members inside Iraq, started to email me. And that made me realize, with my particular focus with the United States Institute of Peace, that we as a nation are talking about reconciliation and are talking about conflict resolution overseas, but we haven't ourselves taken a step back and allowed ourselves the process in terms of a nation of healing. And the type of emails were asking for that type of closure. How do we as a nation begin to heal? What's your role as an American Muslim in mourning for 9/11, or with these Iraqi soldiers' families? A lot of them were asking me, what were our sons doing? We know they were sent, but it's a black hole. We don't know what we achieved in Iraq. We don't know where we are in Iraq. So those were the type of questions I kept getting that made me realize that there was other issues, again, the unintended consequences of the book that raised, I think, these crucial issues about the healing process here back home. I wanted to read excerpts from the book that highlight these aspects. And then again, I don't want to stand up and just talk to you. I want it to be a conversation. So I'll open it up for some dialogue after I read some of the pieces. Throughout my childhood, I struggled to answer the simplest of questions. Where are you from? I was born in Saudi Arabia to Palestinian parents who moved to Lubbock, Texas when I was 6 months old. During my childhood, my parents would uproot me every few years, from Texas to South Carolina to Virginia. Living in the American South, I was far from the image of a Southern belle, and yet the summers I spent in the Middle East only emphasized my American identity and made it clear to me that I would never exactly be the Arab poster child. By the time I was in high school, I had learned to embrace and love all parts of my joint identity with the fervor only a teenager could. I was an Arab and an American. I was a Palestinian and a Southerner. I was a Muslim and a woman. As I grew, I accepted that the emphasis on each facet of my identity would shift with the phases of the moon. Growing up in a world struggling to understand multiculturalism, I saw this ability to move among my many identities as my own secret superpower. Propelled by the conviction that my identities provided me with a competitive advantage, I embarked on a career in international development. My mother argued that somewhere along the lines I became delusional, perhaps because of my obsession that one person could make a difference, which led me into a career in humanitarian aid and in conflict zones. With my secret superpower tucked away, I was among the first international aid workers to arrive in Baghdad in 2003. I would also be among the last to leave. The 2 intervening years inside Iraq would transform my life forever. Many writers have attempted to capture in words what happened in Iraq during the watershed years of 2003 through early 2005. Some authors have written about the political maneuvering behind the walls of the Green Zone, or the military strategy as seen by journalists embedded in the armed forces. But until now, none of them have had access to both everyday Iraqi citizens and the people in power on the US side. In Iraq, I was finally able to put my superpower to full use. A wave of my American passport at the checkpoint of the fortified Green Zone allowed me to access the representatives of the US-led coalition. My adherence to the Muslim dress and my fluent Arabic made it possible for me to live in an Iraqi neighborhood with no armed security. This unique access allowed me to see an Iraq that was not accessible for others. With each passing season, the country would shed its skin from the past and emerge as a completely new place. Who was better positioned to adapt within a country experiencing a period of change than someone who had been raised with an ever-shifting identity herself? In Iraq, I found a place with as many complicated contradictions as I had in myself. Here, though, my internal complexity was manifested in an entire society. My international colleagues were struggling to force Iraqi into convenient boxes, but I simply accepted its unique, fluctuating shape. International journalists marveled at the fact that women who were covered head to toe walked side by side with women with orange-colored hair and wearing tight jeans. I simply shrugged. It was natural to me. The mosaic of identities inside Iraq was not hypocritical or schizophrenic. It was what made the country powerful. Nevertheless, the mosaic was shattered by the eruption of violence that followed on the heels of the U.S. invasion. From weapons of massive destruction to suicide bombings, the lives of everyday Iraqis became linked to violence. The hopes and dreams of Iraqis that they once dared share evaporated in the smoke of car bombs. The diverse people who populated Iraq, Arabs, Kurds, Muslims, Christians, Sabi'in, who once sipped tea at their doorstep, now disappeared from the streets. Women hid behind closed doors. The only images coming from Iraq were of death and destruction. The only feelings that people described were betrayal and despair. Overnight, that brilliant diversity, Iraq's own secret superpower, was forgotten, buried under the rubble left by bombs. It's kind of the first impression in terms of when I entered Iraq. I wanted to share an excerpt from 1 month later when I started to feel that some of the things that I had assumed about Iraq were beginning to change. I had been in Iraq for less than a month, and all my non-negotiables had somehow found their way to the negotiating table. That is, I had mentally drafted absolute truths that were to be held sacred. I had drawn theoretical boundaries that were not to be crossed. Yet day after day, they were shot down like members of the opposition in front of one of Saddam's firing squads. I entered Iraq confident that I had my finger on the pulse of the majority Arab and Muslim viewpoint. I could not have been further from the truth. The more I interacted with the Iraqis, I saw my crystal clear absolute truths morph into disfigured shapes. In my opinion, Bush's war could bring nothing but death and destruction. Yet instead of despair, the Iraqis with whom I interacted with were filled with hopes and dreams of a better future. I had been outraged by the subjugation Iraqis had endured for the past 3 decades at the hand of Western nations. Yet Iraqis were pointing their fingers elsewhere. They openly blamed the Saddam regime for the state of their country. They also blamed their Arab neighbors for having consented through silence to Saddam's tyranny. Many Iraqis went so far as to see the Americans as liberators and defenders of freedom. My first instinct was that they had it all wrong. I cringed with disbelief when I forced myself to watch scenes such as I witnessed in Karbala. I was awed at the sight of the residents of the holy city of Karbala rushing into the streets and ululating with joy, greeting the U.S. soldiers. It was still early in the war, and the U.S. soldiers took great pride in stopping to greet the locals and basking in the warmth of a hero's welcome. Something about the picture seemed intrinsically wrong to me. The women were dressed in their long, flowing abayas as they crowded around the soldiers and yelled, "Down, down, Saddam. Now Iraq will live." I forced myself to simply observe and fought off the 1,000 judgmental thoughts that were threatening to flood my mind. Yet the whispers of doubt remained. What were these women thinking? How could these adolescent boys dressed in desert fatigues, helmets, and bulletproof vests be seen as the heralds of peace? Surely the M16s flung over their shoulders and the pistols bulging at their hips were signs of aggression. How could the Iraqis see the U.S. troops as anything other than occupiers? But guns had become second nature to Iraqis. There was nothing alarming about them. In fact, they represented power and strength, something that Iraqis thought was needed. Time and time again, Iraqis explained to me that the only way to bring peace was through force. I refused to be won over. There was nothing good that could ever come as a result of war and aggression. But somehow, the Iraqi women began to convince me to see the situation through their looking glass. Slowly, I began to accept the idea that there might be a successful scenario on the horizon. Again, when I entered the country, the type of euphoria that was first expressed made me put aside all my own personal doubts. A lot of people who know me from before I went to Iraq in 2003, anti-war protesters standing out, one of the first people out there in terms of speaking against sanctions. And one of the first lessons that you learn, and you probably already studied in international development, is you have to suspend your own viewpoint and listen. It's the most important thing when you enter a new country, is actually just sitting and listening to the community. So interview after interview, as I was speaking with these women, and again, this talk of leaping forward made me realize how much the women anticipated change and thought that this was going to be what women were referring to as the window of opportunity for them in 2003. Now, 10 years later, the last time I was in Iraq was in July, the situation is very different. Women aren't talking about leaping forward again, they're just trying to survive. The electricity, water, most basic services, none of that has improved in Iraq over the last 7 years. In fact, most of the situation has decreased. The access to delivery service, access to health, access to education in the 7 years has actually decreased. Won't tell you more about the specific stories, but what I wanted to do was just share with you the final impression, the way I ended in terms of the 2005 when I left the country, just so that you get a sense of the, what I call emotional roller coaster that you go through war in terms of the difference of opinions. 7 years later, I remain on the sidelines with the sensation that we are not in control of our own destiny. Given the number of death threats Yusuf received after our wedding, we decided to live in Jordan for the first year of our marriage. Maysoon and her children moved into a 3-story villa in Baghdad and joined us in a 3-bedroom apartment in Jordan. Things were slowly getting worse. By 2006, the country was being ripped apart by civil war. Everything I loved in Iraq was being destroyed. In 2007, a series of suicide bombs ripped across Mutanabi Street, shutting down the age-old book market for the next 2 years. The lives of the people I had grown to love were now being torn apart. Fadi's father passed away in the middle of the night. Due to the curfew, the family had to wait until morning to transport the body for burial. Despite the fact that I carried dual citizenship as a Jordanian American, there was no place for Yusuf and me in Amman. There too, we constantly faced new obstacles. As an Iraqi, my husband was considered persona non grata. There was a window of time where Yusuf, like so many other proud Iraqis, was a man without a country, waiting in limbo for a new passport. But we found a way to return to Iraq, this time in a different capacity. Over the last few years, I have worked to support local civil society groups, and Yusuf and I were part of the preparations for the March 2010 elections. Iraqis, friends, and family discussed the years of 2007 and 2008 as the dark ages. Their eyes glaze over, recalling the immense fear that overwhelmed every neighborhood. I have worked in other conflict-torn countries, but my time in Iraq haunts me more than any place I have been. I am unable to put the experience behind me. It maddens me that so many of the mistakes that pushed Iraq into chaos were avoidable. From the outset of the U.S. invasion, those in power in Iraq repeatedly betrayed the people of Iraq by standing on the sidelines as the society crumbled and by making promises they could not keep. And I have found a profound sense of guilt when I think of the women of Iraq, whose cases I have never been able to close. When I fled Iraq, I also fled from them, and I can't help but feel that I left them stranded. Iraqis are faced with a bleak dilemma. If they stay in their country, their lives are at risk. But if they leave their country, they are made to feel like a burden in their new homes. Essentially, they are forced to choose between death and humiliation. I think that kind of shows the broad switch and the roller coaster of emotions that I went through while working in Iraq. Again, I think that to have a beneficial conversation, I'd like to open it up. If you have questions, if you have thoughts about the situation in Iraq, about the role of women in conflict, as I mentioned, seeing them as a barometer of success, not just seeing them as something that's helpless that we must support. And finally, just the different identities that were explored in terms of what I came back in my background when I went into Iraq. I'd be happy to start a conversation.
What is the first thing you look towards when trying to empower women when you're in Iraq? Like, what's the first step you take towards getting them to realize their potential in the community?
One of the things that... Sure.
Sorry.
Okay, just because I have the mic. So, what's the first thing that I look for when I enter a country in terms of helping women realize their potential in the discussions? One of the things is no matter what country I've been in, again, whether it's Yemen, which is one of the most difficult countries to work on women, or a situation like Palestine where women are much more liberated, almost all women know their potential. It's really a matter of, and the first thing that I do is finding out what's already taking place. So, who are the women activists? Who are the leaders in the community, and what are they doing to improve the situation? Very rarely will you enter any community where activities aren't already taking place. And the next step is then asking, what's the gap? How can I support the organizations or the individuals that are already working? And it's particularly important because something that I might identify as a priority is often not seen as a priority. So to give you an example, again, now if you go into Iraq and someone who's worked in Iraq, so 2003, if you went into Iraq, women were talking about rights, they were talking about the Constitution, and they wanted to find ways to enshrine their rights in the old 1958 personal status law. So very elite rule of law, this is how we're going. If you were to go to the exact same place in Iraq now, they're going to tell you healthcare is the primary issue, security, and access to education. So even if you have some exposure, it's really going in and saying, what are your priorities, who's doing what, and then how can I be a part of that? And I think that that's the first step that I try to follow when I go into any country. Yes?
It's very interesting to hear of the personal transformation that you experienced in going to Iraq with certain notions about what it would mean to be there, and then in fleeing Iraq at the end. You talk about this shift having resulted from experiencing vicariously through the women you encountered in 2003, this sense of optimism that now that the dictator was gone, things would get better. Why didn't they actually get better?
Again, I outlined crucial mistakes that were made early on. One of the issues, I'll talk more generally, I mean, we probably have all heard, the military was dissolved right away. So the moment we went in 2003, by August, the Iraqi military was dissolved, and which created a lot of men who were armed and well-trained being jobless at home. Even then, you didn't see spikes in violence. It took up to a year later for the violence to happen, which is basically none of these men found employment. They found no way of surviving. Electricity began to get, all the basic services began to deteriorate. So that was one of the crucial mistakes that was made, is that you've dissolved the army. If you look at Occupation 101, you usually take off the top heads. So, the U.S. came in trying to start everything from scratch without recognizing that they could have learned from, and to be frank, other occupiers like the British or other European nations who were trying to advise a different policy. Like the British, in terms of the times of colonization, they were offering very clear ways in terms of this is what should be done, that it should be done with, take out the top military leaders, don't do a full, which is the second thing, don't do a full depacification process. So there was a lot of people who were coming in who had previous experience ruling a nation that wasn't their own, and were saying this is what we've learned in the process and this is what should be done. Better, I mean, again, it's the provisional authority is what it's technically called, but yes, it's better rulers of the country and coming in, because under the Geneva Convention, when Iraq entered in 2003, it was the invaders who became responsible for governance. And what ended up happening was that they took the responsibility, and that's how the CPA was formed, the Coalition Provisional Authority, and by that time, Bremer, who was the head of CPA, basically became the equivalent to the decision maker or the president of Iraq. So those were the decision makers, and these were the decisions that they took. 7 years later, these decisions are still having impact. So one of those decisions was dissolving the military. The other decision was a depacification process, which was, basically turned in the end into a witch hunt. And to be clear, I mean, these decisions were being advised by expatriate Iraqis. So it was a mix of, what was being held, but what wasn't part of the decision making was the local leadership. The third thing was that the borders, there was absolutely no way of securing the borders. So that was something that was, pointed out as one of the crucial mistakes. I remember going in and out of Iraq early in 2003. We were driving in, no checking of passports, nothing. So it opened up the borders to anyone who wanted to come in and out of Iraq. Those are kind of like the headlines. This is what people will often talk about. I also like to point out, again, looking at women as a barometer of success. Early in 2003, you saw this optimism, you saw this, but you also saw things that were beginning to emerge that hadn't been previously in Iraq. So for example, you had a small number of cases of rapes in Iraq in 2003. Under the Saddam regime, you had violence against women, but it was always government sanctioned. It was never random. So no one would dare to oppose Saddam Hussein, although you had institutional rape and institutional violence against women. But what we were talking about in 2003 was very random. It was gangs. It was tribal disputes where there was an emergence of violence against women. Nothing extreme like Rwanda or Kosovo, but enough to raise, again, this red flag. When it was being discussed, it was always attributed to just a women's issues, and it was dismissed. And you actually started hearing things like, oh, it's natural in Arab or Islamic cultures for this to happen. This isn't anything that we can intervene with. Now, again, 7 years later, we can look at that as the emergence of there was no local police authority on the ground. There was no way of securing that vacuum of local order. And in 2006 and 2007, General Petraeus identified that as one of the main reasons for the deterioration of the situation in Iraq. If we had paid attention early on and not just dismissed it as a women's issue, we might have been able to really catch some of these trends that happen in Iraq. The other issue, which I already alluded to, was a lot of dependence was given to expatriate Iraqis, and the local leadership who had stayed inside Iraq had a very different viewpoint and a very different set of recommendations. They were never invited to the decision-making tables. Now they're becoming to be the main players inside Iraq, but if we had brought them in early on, again, there might be a different scenario that have played out.
Can I just ask a follow-up? You talk about things that appeared as red flags, like these acts of rape that were conducted by gangs, and how does that indicate a problem that's any different from what you had stated earlier when you mentioned bringing things up to people in Iraq, and they always argue that security comes first?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Saying that security came first?
No, I'm saying that, I don't remember saying that security came thing.
Occurred after 2003.
2003, I think they're two separate issues, so let me kind of divide them out. 2003, if you asked what the priority was, Iraqi women were talking about the Constitution and talking about other issues because security wasn't a huge issue. It wasn't this mass lack of control on the ground in the streets. By 2006, if you asked women, and probably till today, it became electricity, it became security, it became access to healthcare and access to education. So there was a shift in priorities dramatically from 2003 to 2007. Until today, the situation hasn't stabilized the way it was even in 2003. And keep in mind, this is after 12 years of sanctions. So until today, we haven't been able, and most basic delivery of services hasn't stabilized. And the other issue in terms of the indication that I was saying in terms of the red flag is that these incidents were almost zero. You never heard about the random acts of violence on the street that were beginning to occur in 2003. The reason why they never took international attention is because it never reached Bosnia or Rwanda levels. It was, you're talking about a very small spike. But that spike in violence could have led us to realize that there was another indicator, which was, again, a lack of the local police force and a lack of security on the ground that was beginning to emerge. In 2006 and 2007, it became uncontrollable. In 2003, it was just like this little spike that happened. Does that clarify a bit? Should I give priority to students? Go ahead.
Wherever they may be?
Yeah, the estimates of the refugees leaving Iraq were about 4 million. 2 million are actually displaced people, 2 million inside, and the 2 million refugees that were outside, predominantly in Jordan and Syria. The United Nations is the primary one who's registering and trying to support these refugees. The United States is one of the few countries who opened the door. But if you look at it compared to other refugee crises, and particular, let's say the average would be 20 to 30,000 people that would be relocated a month. In Iraq, that's been happening a year, 10 to 15,000 a year annually. So if you compare to other crises, it's much less. If you compare to Europe, the United States is doing much more. And that's in terms of accepting the refugees for resettlement in the U.S. Definitely. I mean, especially when I went into Iraq, I was, still very young, very opinionated, particularly very passionate about women's issues. And a part of our job was to kind of push the envelope in terms of rights and, open that discussion. In terms of the moral support, the first thing that we do is if there's need for the most basics of service like livelihood, or we would have discussions about health care. We start there because most of the women want a tangible discussion. They don't want this democracy. Until now, people will roll their eyes when you talk about freedom and that stuff. So we start with the tangible development projects, and then start entering about the other issues which deal with rights and. And I remember one particular situation where I was in this position. We were trying to recruit women for a job skills training. And this was in an area about an hour and a half outside of Baghdad. And, I would go from household to household. It was, the initial community assessment. And women after women kept telling me, we can't work. It's haram. It's forbidden Islamically for us to work. And everything that I know about Islam, that's not true. And so, I went back and I say, I can't accept this answer. This isn't the right answer. What's happening? And, tried to argue a little bit with the women, but they were very much like, no, this is the rule. We're not going to work. And even if we wanted to, the children's uncle, because most of these women are widows, won't allow us. We're not leaving the house. We're not going to work. You don't have food on the table. Your children are crying. This will empower you. Not buying it. And so one of my colleagues was like, well, why don't you go and ask the imam? If you're so convinced that this is religiously not acceptable, why don't you go and ask one of the religious leaders? And that's exactly what I did. We ended up going up all the way to the primary source in Najaf, to Imam Sistani's office, and saying, can we have women work if, it's a war zone and stuff? And the fatwa, the religious ruling we received from his office, is it's not only allowed, but it's required to provide women job skills training. And we went back to the exact same neighborhood with that fatwa, and our program was flooded. Women instantly joined. Yeah, and it's an important lesson because I think for a lot of development agencies, the whole development model came out in the 70s in a very secular way of thinking. There's almost a resistance, and even inside me, there was a little bit of a resistance of going to religious institutions, although that is the way that you negotiate access, and it's a great entry point. So when we were able to do that, it really did strengthen the program, and it provided women who are our target the comfort they needed to join the program. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's nothing more powerful that can be manipulated as a motivator or as a, as Marx calls the opium, and other than religion. So, when you're taught, when you're not literate, when you're being taught what religion is over and over and again, to actually find out and be educated and dig deeper is a certain luxury when you're, under sanctions and trying to survive, and that you just don't have. And I think that was the big issue. Iraq is one of those situations where you'll find women, grandmothers, who are literate, who are educated, who know their rights. Again, the personal status law, which is one of the leading personal status laws in the region, very progressive and supports women's rights, was passed in 1958 in Iraq. Iraqi women had the right to vote in 1980. Some of the neighbors still don't have that right. So you'll find grandmothers who know their Islamic rights, who know their rights, who know the details, who will quote Quranic ayahs, who will quote rulings to you. And you'll find granddaughters who are illiterate. So a huge gap because of the wars and the sanctions in Iraq. And one of the things that we've done in Iraq and in Yemen and other countries is bring kind of this Islamic interpretation so that people who are using it against women can then take it and use it back and say, that's not what I was taught. And it's extremely powerful, and you can see from the development perspective how that's beginning to break down these walls of knowledge. A lot of them are, but again, it's the control factor. So, the literacy, survival, all that issues for the grandmothers done to the granddaughters. There's only so much trickle information when they're just trying to survive. So the grandmother's working 2 jobs. The grandmother is no longer in charge of her own daughter because, you had a rise of early marriage coming back into Iraq, which had been completely erased by the 1980s. So they're no longer in the same household. There's just several factors that make it more and more difficult from the day-to-day level to be able to pass down that information. The one thing they did pass down was the stories of the pride of Iraqi women. So, even the most illiterate women would say Iraqi women were leading the region. I remember my grandmother went for a scholarship and she taught Arabic in Tunisia. Like, you had this living memory where Iraqi women knew it could be better, and we're saying that's the Iraq we want back. So that's what they were able to pass down. Yes, Jamil, sorry. Yes, I'm sorry.
While I'm reading your book, it becomes very clear that everybody has to make very ambiguous, ambivalent, complex moral choices. And one of them, I think you did, but as far as I know, you were in anti-war demonstrations against the war, but then you went to Iraq after the war happened. And somebody might have described you as a collaborator of the occupation, that you're trying to fix the problem caused by the occupation. But we do know that that wasn't the case, and there were many other complex choices that you have to make and others have to make. How did you talk among yourself about these issues? Let's say NGOs.
Yeah.
Because some of the NGOs, it seems that they were trying to stay away from the green zone, but they have to collaborate with them. So what were the interesting moral choices you have to think about?
As to be expected, it's a great question, and it actually hits the crux of what we call the humanitarian space, where the NGOs can work. And one of the things that's become threatened, and I would say it initially started from Somalia, but Iraq really brought it into the forefront, is that the humanitarian space is shrinking. So at one point, you had this huge humanitarian space, which is, again, where the NGOs are able to provide work to, with the local communities to give the most basic services. And that's now been flooded by military. So you have the U.S., you have other coalition groups that are flooding this same space by contractors who are now coming in and paid to do this type of work, and it's shrinking and shrinking. And to kind of go back to my own personal narrative, it was a big decision. What do I do? And not only did I discuss it with other NGOs, I discussed it with my own community and my own family in terms of how do you strike that balance. And I had worked in Iraq previously under sanctions. And one of the things that became very clear was that the Iraqis themselves were resentful that not enough of the community, and I'm speaking specifically about the Muslim community and then the Arab community, not enough people responded to Iraq when it was in need. And everyone stood on the sidelines, which I was a part of, objecting to the sanctions, but who was in the country helping the Iraqis? And I didn't want that to happen again. I wanted to be there. I wanted to kind of earn the right to complain, because I knew I was going to be a complainer. So I said, if I'm going to complain about the situation in Iraq, then I want to earn that right by going and working side by side. And I drew boundaries. And again, those boundaries, you're right, were constant negotiation of saying, I'll go to Iraq, but I'll never live in the IZ. I want to live amongst the Iraqis. And in 2005, when it became dangerous and I could no longer live, I decided to leave. And I felt that if I had to live in a military base, that means I'm not needed. I need to leave. And I decided to leave rather than live on a base or anything like that. So that was some of the lines. Other NGOs decided to take a stronger stance. Most of the international NGOs were out of Iraq by October 2003. So very early on, you had Oxfam and some of the other NGOs out. Red Cross that pulled out because of the bombing. I think it was also by October 2003. So by the beginning of 2004, which was only 6 or 7 months later, you had virtually no international NGOs on the ground in Iraq. I mean, the few that stayed were up north. And what ended up happening was the Iraqi public had no interaction with any international community except military. Now, if you go to Afghanistan, it's a very different situation. Let's hope it stays that way, where you have a large presence of international NGOs, where you have, not even in terms of, you don't have just the U.S., you have a coalition. But in Iraq, it became only U.S. military and U.S. contractors. That was the only interaction. And I felt even stronger that I needed to be there to prevent a different face. They needed to see something else. They needed to see the NGO worker. They needed to see the aid worker. They needed to see the civilian side to know, A, that the American public is diverse and that there's a different approach, and then also that they weren't forgotten. So that was kind of how I made peace with that. But the military-civilian relationship in the humanitarian space is a very live current debate. And at the Institute, the U.S. Institute of Peace, where I work, it's one of the things that we're trying to have more dialogue and discussions about is where do you draw those lines? What type of interactions do you have? The NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, have a code of conduct, an international code of conduct that they follow. And one of them is absolutely neither you carry arms or you don't interact with anyone who carries arms. And I believe again, if you are entering a community armed, you're sending a message. But what's happening in Somalia and what's happening in places like Iraq and even Gaza, you're not able to enter these areas at all. And so there becomes a negotiation of the lesser of evil. What do? You can't enter these areas, but people are starving. Do you take that moral stand and say we refuse to work? Or Darfur is another great example. We refuse to work in this area because that means we would have to be, what's the word? Someone taking you in, you'd have to escorted, that's the word I'm looking for. You'd have to be escorted by military. I mean, that's, the big question now that the humanitarian organizations are struggling with.
I have two questions. I ask one and then we'll see. And it's the bigger question, and I know this is a very academic question to a degree, because I'm interested in sort of a follow-up to what she was asking, which is if you go into a country in a crisis situation, and it's a quote-unquote non-Western country, you clearly go there, you're talking about development, and that's what these organizations are often called, with a particular sort of linear idea of what development is and where it's supposed to lead, which comes with a set of assumptions about that's how people are supposed to live. And it seems to me, particularly regarding women's issues, that's not the only way of looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
Does it make sense?
It does make sense. And I think it's a difficult situation. Again, this kind of goes a little bit to the multiple identities in terms of the fact that I had these different identities. I came in and was able to negotiate not only with the Iraqis, but with a lot of the women activists who were coming internationally with their ideas and let's do this, let's burn the burqa, and say, oh, burqas are Afghanistan, not Iraq. And, having that type of dialogue kind of serving that bridge. And it's a difficult conversation because what I've noticed, the trend goes to either extreme. One extreme is women or international community who's coming to support women's issues or development will go to an extreme of becoming so religiously and culturally relative that everything becomes permissible. So any type of abuse or any type of thing people will, again, dismiss as this is part of the religion. And they see that as being the progressive, listeners and stuff without really analyzing what are the socioeconomic factors that have led to that. And then, of course, the other extreme, which is still the majority, is that we know what's best, listen to us, this is how we're going to make things better. Most of these communities, the women themselves will push back. And what enters into the factor is the donor community. So you have local groups who are working, within their masjid or within their community centers who are pushing back and saying, we don't want this model of the extreme. But because they often don't speak English, and it really is almost as simple as that. It's not that donors don't want to fund them. Because they don't speak English and they don't know how to fill out the forms and they're very underfunded. Or there's other groups that become funded by other extreme groups, and then you have this polarization. But the solution really is to find that local voice, as what's happening locally, how do we support it as much as possible, so that you counter. You'll always have organizations going in with, we know what's going on, we know what the best way for development. It's not just for women's issues, economics. We know the best way for economic laws and economic policies to make this country grow. We know the best way for ruling. We know, and the only way to balance that out is to make sure that there's enough local institutions who are supported that can actually add a second voice to the debate. At this point, most of the issues dealing with women are monopolized by very secular, Western educated, elite women who don't have access within their own communities to their rural and their grassroots, and it creates a complete unbalanced conversation. Your second question, or is that?
Can you describe your interaction with the military and contractors a bit more from what their attitude towards you were, and how that could have either enabled or prevented you from what you wanted to do?
Yeah, it's.
That's my second question.
That was your second question? Okay, great. Great minds think alike. In terms of my interaction, contractors, I hardly interacted with contractors at all. And I went into Iraq thinking that the military was the worst group that I could interact with. I left thinking contractors are the worst group that I can interact with. And at one point, the U.S. Embassy asked me, if it was a really sadistic exercise, but if you were kidnapped or killed, who would you suspect? And I was like, okay. And I listed the top 5 U.S. contractors because that's really who I thought would end up killing me because they were the worst. So no interaction with contractors, and particularly the big ones, definitely no interaction with the security contractors. With the military, I found myself growing more and more sympathetic and began to group them with the group of victims in terms of they were so young, so eager to help. I mean, they were stopping me left and right. The moment, and word got out that there's this American Muslim Arab who's living outside in the red zone, which is all of Iraq. Green zone's about 5 miles. So it was like, there is this, woman. So people started trying to find me. Where is this American Muslim? And they started, and I would have never had to deal with, Women for Women is a development agency. We don't deal with rape and we don't deal with honor crimes. Literally, these U.S. soldiers were bringing me all these women who were, either raped or had honor crimes because I was the only one that they could talk to. So I was forced in a lot of awkward situations where I didn't want to deal with the military, but I now have, in some cases, as young as a 9-year-old girl in front of me. Am I going to turn her? Am I going to turn her away? So that's where some of the negotiations began, and it was very hard. It was a very hard struggle because I didn't want to have to deal with these issues. But I was told over and over, if I don't take the girls, that they were just not going to. They were going to leave them in the streets. And so I found myself in these situations where I was working with the military to kind of take the girls away from them as quickly as possible, because my first attempt is always reconciliation with the family. And the longer they're with the military, the more difficult it becomes to do a reconciliation. So that was, one of the issues. But as it became involved and began to know some of, one of the stories is about a friendship that I developed with a female soldier. And, her strong ethics and desire to make change really opened my eyes in terms of, the different complexities that are there. So that's kind of my interaction and how I got into the situation. The way soldiers viewed me as an aid worker, they found that was one of the first feedbacks I got, that we were very whining and why are we always complaining, and they have to wear these horrible uniforms and live in these horrible bases where we're living in the hotels and eating kebabs and stuff. So that was one of the first complaints I got from the soldiers. The other thing is, are you really American? That was, whenever I would speak, my favorite line from a soldier was, he was like, it's like my cat's talking to me. Because he just couldn't comprehend that I was a covered woman, American Muslim, who grew up in the South, who was speaking English. He was just like, please don't talk, it's making my head boggle. He used to always joke every time I would go to the checkpoint because he just couldn't comprehend that I spoke English and without an accent. So there was a kind of a little bit of disbelief. There were others with suspicion, particularly the high-ranking. A couple of the cases that I ended up taking, I was thrown off because I wasn't listening, and I was, I think I was listening, but I wasn't agreeing with him. So a lot of times I was thrown off cases. So there was times when I was viewed with suspicion and saying, this woman isn't what we want, throw her off the case, and the girls that I was helping would then be taken away from me. So, it was quite a diverse, different way of how I was viewed. In the beginning, because of my activities in the U.S., for the first 6 months, I was blackballed by the CPA. So I wasn't allowed on the green zone because it was well known that I was against the war. And, I think war is bad because it tends to really hurt women, and women bear the brunt of war. That was the extent of the line that I was saying, and that was enough to get me blackballed. So you can imagine if people who were really anti-war, where they fed into the equation. But after 6 months, and I would say particularly after the beginning of 2004, there was no one else living outside the IZ. And I was one of the only people who stayed after Fallujah. So they began asking me to come into some of the senior meetings. And ironically, the person who took who began to have me give policy briefings was the British ambassador, not the U.S. ambassador. So I developed a stronger relationship with the British side in giving policy briefings on women and what was going on inside Iraq than I did with the U.S. And when Bremer was in power, I had very little relationship with that side of things. Does that answer your question, or?
Yes. To follow up, these briefings, etc., how do you feel those were helpful? Did you see any real change on the ground based on your feedback or other ways?
Definitely not. No feedback. I mean, a little bit in terms of the desire. I guess the answer would be hindsight is 20/20. So we would give the feedback, we would give the feedback, we would give the feedback. When things would completely go into chaos, they would come back and be like, wasn't there that crazy covered American Muslim woman who was talking about why electricity is important? Bring her back. So that's kind of the impact that we had. Is only after, and The worst thing is, I mean, one of the things that I'm doing a lot now is talking about the lessons learned between Iraq and Afghanistan. And they're totally separate countries, very different contexts, very different socioeconomic background, but what they share in common is the U.S. intervention. And what lessons need to be learned is from the U.S. side, is what can be learned. And everything I've seen so far and been involved in so far, they're not learning those lessons either. So we're almost doing the exact same mistakes we did in Iraq now in Afghanistan with this shift. And I don't know if that's just the way the world works, that we have to keep making the same mistakes over and over. But that's pretty much what kept happening. Oh, sorry. You guys get to choose.
I know your focus was women, but I have a question about children. How has their tolerance for, how's that been affected? What do they have their ethics changed? Has being exposed to rape and things like that made them desensitized?
Has made what?
Made them desensitized?
Not so. Iraqis have a huge challenge in terms of violence. Very used to before, Iran, Iraq. There's a huge level of tolerance for violence. It's definitely the type of mental health and trauma issues that are in the country. I don't think we'll ever really begin to address because of the other issues, but it's a big problem. It's a big issue, particularly with the youth. But if they're desensitized to anything now, let's say in 2010, I would say it's politics. The youth are really pushing back very strongly in terms of being politically active. And this is, again, remnants of resentment towards the Ba'athist regime, but now because of all the struggles for power. You had the elections this year and still no government. So, the youth are basically like, we don't want anything to do politically. The other positive trend is they're pushing back on all the ethnic and sectarian talk. They're really pushing back, saying that got us nothing. It got our parents kicked out. It got my father killed. So you're seeing a very strong pushback from the youth on those levels. One of the activities that we did in Iraq was we did training on human rights. This was early on in 2004, 2005, trainings on human rights, and then we would ask them to draw what they thought of when they thought of human rights. And you could just see a lot of awareness, a lot of tongue-in-cheek, a lot of responses in terms, some people drew Abu Ghraib, and it was like a direct response to us as the U.S. Institute of Peace. If you're talking about human rights, go teach yourself, so there was a lot of that tongue-in-cheek, but there was also a lot of the more positive in terms of a one Iraq. They were drawing the different ethnicities. They drew a combination of a church and a Senate and a mosque, and you could just see that concept was really strong within the youth, that they wanted that to come back to Iraq. Going back to the grandmother and grandchild, that was the other common narrative, was most Iraqi, from the older generation, remembered a diverse Iraq. So, my husband's family always talk about their Jewish neighbors. They remember a very diverse Iraq, and they're saying, we've always been diverse, and this has always been the beauty of Iraq since the time of the Khalifa. So there is a desire for that to come back, and the youth have heard that narrative and will often say it, although they've never experienced it, that, Iraq is diverse, and we have all these neighbors, and we used to have all of this. So that trend is, again, a very positive one. The violence, most Iraqi youth are really adamant about it not coming from Iraq and coming from neighbors. So there's also a lot of, I would argue, maybe a little bit of denial in terms of, they're so positive that they're not even willing to begin to address what possibly could be coming from their own communities. There was another question.
Something related to what we're talking about. Iraqi women were the victims of the war, and the ensuing sectarian conflicts. Do you think Iraqi women have a different perception from the men on the issue of Sunni and Shia conflict?
It's hard to say if it's different, but the work that we've done with some of the women who were widows from both sides, from the Sunni and the Shia, initially there was a lot of desire for revenge that was coming from the women. So if anything, the widows were saying, we want our husband or our son, if it was the mothers, saying that, we want revenge for the blood that was shed, which then means it can enter into an endless kind of tribal back and forth between the families. So that was kind of how if anything, the women were a little bit more towards the division. But the programs that we did when they met each other, they were more likely to forgive than when we brought men together. So the first reaction was very much the women were stronger than the men in terms of the division. But the potential in terms of response to reconciliation and to understanding the other was stronger among the women. Does that make sense? Oh. Which one?
The Hadini jail.
I've never been to.
The only women's jail in Iraq. And I read an article weeks ago that talked about the poor conditions of women. Their husbands were accused of terrorism, so they're taken there with their children. So do you guys get a chance?
I don't know if that's accurate that it's the only women's prison. I visited other female prisons. I don't think I've visited that specific one, unless it's the same one that's in Rasafa, which is the one that I've visited. And there's also in the governorate. So, for example, Fallujah, Tikrit, they're very proud of their women's prison because they didn't have that before. So there is other women's prisons. And you're right. I mean, what you brought up was a really important issue. Under the new constitution and the way that the anti-terrorism laws are, is that a woman, it's total a catch-22. A woman who doesn't report her husband for terrorist activity gets thrown in jail with him. And usually that means the children too. And there's not enough conditions, there's not enough space for these women. Now the reason why I say it's a catch-22 because it's not as simple as just reporting your husband, which of course isn't simple, but it's not as, it doesn't end there. Under the Constitution as well, an Iraqi man, all he has to do is complain about his wife, and she gets thrown in jail. So, there is, it's a morphosis of Beit Allah, like of the house of obedience. They've switched it. So women, I mean, if they want to complain, then, he has that power to throw them in jail. And in fact, there was a situation in Tikrit, in this woman's prison, where a woman turned in her husband because and she was worried about her sons, because she had older sons. So she was thinking very much like, I don't want my children being pulled into this extremist activity. So she turned in her husband, and while he was being arrested, he accused her of adultery. So they both got thrown in jail. And so, with this type of issue, women really don't have a choice. So the law works against them in both ways, and you're seeing both juvenile jails and women's jails, a huge increase of people who are coming inside. And it's one of the things that we're beginning to try and look at is how do we work, even if they've come in with the juveniles, how do we rehabilitate? And with the women, how do we provide better circumstances? And we've provided funding for that jail in Tikrit for female doctors to visit and to try and monitor, and also trying to do training of Iraqi police on how to handle female prisoners because it's become such an issue.
Maybe last two questions.
I wanted to ask about what your opinion was of the article that was in Time about leaving Afghanistan where the woman had her nose cut off. And you had read that article or gone back to the women's rights?
I haven't read that article, and for a writer, I'm pretty illiterate when it comes to these mainstream magazines because, my general sense is it's never deep enough. But maybe if you tell me a little bit about the article, I can give you a bit of a feeling, but response or.
What happened was there was backlash to the article because of what they had chosen for the cover image.
Uh-huh.
And they thought that was exploitative, but other people said that it drew more awareness. And so, I guess my question is, would you consider it exploitative of the media to use such a provocative image to grab people's attention, or do you think that ends up being more effective with those kind of cheap?
Yeah. Again, it's a hard one. Generally, I have an issue when children or women or any victims are portrayed the way that we portray them as victim only. I'd like to be able to present them in their survivor or that active citizen mode, because it's you're constantly building on their humiliation to gain support or awareness. That said, sometimes shock therapy, particularly on hard issues, is really important. And I would say it depends on the percentage. I mean, what's I think misleading is if it's a very rare circumstance and then it's presented as the case study or the front page. I find that to be very misleading. But for example, one of the organizations that I work with that's based in the north of Iraq takes pictures of all the the children that are born out of wedlock that are killed. So, and she has actually a deal with the hospital. So they'll call her, and she takes these photos, and she uses them when she's arguing with policymakers, Iraqi policymakers, who say this doesn't exist, this is a Western plot, this never happens. And she, as a Kurdish woman, then takes out these pictures. And she says it instantly silences the policymakers. And she's actually managed to get the Kurdish government and the Kurdish police to pass a lot of laws that protect women based on this strategy. So if used effectively, I think it can be an important tool if there's truly an issue or an epidemic or a large issue. Unfortunately, I don't believe that's how our media uses it. So I do find it exploitative in that aspect. I just wanted to point out the exception where it can be positive. But the way that we're using it, it's very misleading, it's very misinformed, and it often hurts the women's movement inside these countries because it creates a defensive reaction by the international community or by the neighbors.
Yes, I want to ask you a question about men.
Yes.
I just have a question. In Iraq, what attitudes among men, did you mention that you had brought men together for reconciliation purposes, but that they didn't respond as well as the women? What attitudes among Iraqi men did you notice towards women or to the rights of women in general?
Iraqi men feel so overwhelmed by the different issues in terms, and you have to understand, conflict strips away the basics of masculinity. So men's responsibility is to protect and to provide. So when you have conflict, or even just mass poverty, but when you have conflict, that ability to provide and protect is taken away, which creates the defensiveness, which creates a trend of violence against women, so it's not because they hate women. Very few cases are people who actually, they exist, but very few cases is that's the motivator. And that's one of the things that we will work with men, is particularly if we're dealing with women's issues, is what is your role, how do you work? And one of the training manuals I actually put together was leadership training for men, which was all about women, but why women are important, why address women, and a lot of people very much opened it. Men in particular, there are times when 3-4 weeks would go by when I was doing a needs assessment and interaction before I would ever see a woman. I always had to meet with the men first. And men in particular will fall they want to hear the Islamic and cultural arguments, and that's what I use a lot. So when I enter into an area, for example, when I introduce about Cuba, I'll start talking about this is a historical trend within Islam where women have always been promoted. So for example, the first person to enter Islam was a woman. The first martyr in Islam is a woman. And when you start those stories, they jump in and they'll be like, did you know that the first person who was entrusted the Quran was a woman? So suddenly you have the men giving me all this ammunition about how pro-women Islam is. And you start that conversation and then you go into more, we've kind of lost it around the years. If you notice, we're not implementing what once used to be. And you get them to start talking about the reality of the gap in the situation. But you've comforted them by the reference point, by the base. So men are very open to that. The reason why women are more open to reconciliation, I just want to point it out because the feminist in me has to point this part out. I don't think it's because women versus men. I think it's power dynamics. And, men will give up a lot more in the reconciliation problems than women who don't have that same access to that power or to the decision maker would have to in order for that reconciliation to go. So it's not necessary, it's obviously not biological. There's also the power structures and the role of society and the upbringing that comes into the differentiation.
Since there are only 15 minutes, only 15 minutes to the next class, so we want to give enough time for you all to look at the book. And if those of you who have the book, you can have Manal to sign it. So she'll be sitting in the front with the books. And a final note that we have, final two notes, is that please stay around. We have still drinks and snacks to consume. And this way you get to know and then talk to our speaker. And finally, please pick up our flyer for this semester's events, and also follow the events through the webpage called islamicstudiescenter.gmu.edu. Should be easy, Islamic Studies Center, which it also links with the Facebook account. And there's a video catalog of all the lectures in vimeo.com. And you can also click Islamic Studies Center and you can watch the videos of previous events. So we hope to see you in the next round of events, and thank you for coming. And thank Manal for giving an amazing presentation. And we hope to see her on campus more often. Now, okay, other than that.